Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm glad to welcome you to the second day of the Understanding China conference. I'm David Orlandi, EU Partnership Manager for EU SME Centre, and it's my honor and pleasure to be hosting you today for this conference. Building up on what we've discussed yesterday when we talked about the economic outlook of China, the trade relation with the EU, we want today, on the other hand, to tackle more sector-specific issues that can be transversal for all of the companies that would like to export to China. So to this end, today we're going to be talking about cybersecurity and connectivity, IPR protection, as well as industrial dynamics with a focus on free trade zones and high-tech zones. The Understanding China conference has the goal to provide to BSOs, TPOs, chambers of commerce, all of the partners of EU SME Centre an overview of the current situation of relations with China, as well as to provide small and medium enterprises the instruments to start and dwell and understand better the realities of the Chinese market. With that being said, I would like to start with the first panel of the day, focusing on cybersecurity and connectivity. We will be having a 1 hour and 20 minutes discussion on this, followed by a short coffee break. So without further ado, I would like to welcome to the stage Mr. Tom Nunlist, Associate Director of Trivium China. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you folks for having me here this morning. It's great to be invited by the EU SME Centre. As I said to a few folks, my first time in Europe as well, so pretty good stuff. Let's see. Okay, great. So for those of you who haven't heard, Trivium China, we are a boutique policy research consultancy. We go very deep on sort of regulation, policy, politics in China, and try to explain for folks how the policy sausage really is made. As you probably understand, China, I think more so than other markets, market outcomes are driven by government decision making, and so our very deep understanding of what's going on and ability to predict the policy future really helps give our clients an edge in China. I'm Associate Director on our technology team, where I focus primarily on data policy, which is what I'm going to talk with you about today. So 2024 has really been a milestone year for data regulatory policy in China. We've seen really positive, meaningful breakthroughs for SMEs when it comes to cross-border data transfer. However, significant uncertainties remain, and there's really, I'd say, at least a 5 or 6 year timeline before this regime really, I think, becomes hammered out all the way. I'm going to have 5 sections. We'll focus a little bit for a few minutes on understanding where we are in the big picture. Then I'll go through 3 specific developments from this year, the March rules that relaxed data compliance obligations overall, the emerging role of FTZs in this regime, and then a little bit about the network data security management regulations and what those mean. And finally, some practical implications. So understanding the big picture, I won't spend too much on this slide, but I really want to situate us in kind of where we're at in this whole story. This has been about 10 years that this regime has been sort of conceptualized, formulated, and rolled out. And the message I want you to take away today is that we're moving out of what I see as a period of effective trial implementation for a few years and into what you might say proper implementation. What happened this year was an important recalibration of the basic rule sets, like what China's trying to do, its kind of viewpoints on this, and then a solidification of experience of trial and error over the past several years. Developments this year signal rebalanced regulatory priorities and, importantly, increased confidence on the part of officials in the structure of this system. The good news is the practical impact on SMEs, I think, is substantial and largely positive, although the overall regime does remain strict and there are a lot of questions. And again, full maturity, I think, will not be reached for another few years. So taking a look at the March 2024 rules, hopefully I'm not beating too much of a dead horse with you guys. I'm sure you've spent some time trying to understand this already. again, to situate us, these are really correcting an error that happened that goes back to September 2022, which is the kind of trial rollouts of the data export security measures, which I really see as a kind of botched attempt. I recall looking at these rules in 2022, doing the initial analysis and speaking with my colleagues and asking, how is the government actually going to do this? How is this going to be successful? And of course, it turned out it was not. There's a few key reasons for that. The first I would say was maybe CACs, it's the Cyberspace Administration of China, kind of like overemphasis on security, a little bit of an overcooked attitude, in terms of like how strict they wanted to be. And then really incomplete key details. China's trying to roll out a system that wasn't fully worked out all the way with missing details and an understaffed bureaucracy. I don't think I need to explain the sort of difficulties and headaches that led to for all companies across the board, large and small. But suffice it to say, a correction to the state of affairs quickly became inevitable, and then we saw draft measures released in September 2023. And those, of course, were the ones that were finalized in March after much anticipation. I want to pull out 4 specific things from these regulations that are the big takeaways. Number 1 is that certain activities are exempted from security assessments or the lower compliance bar, which is standardized contracts. And that's like the data relating to international trade, cross-border transportation, really kind of like everyday commerce activities, if they do not contain personal information and important data. And then similarly, personal information related to, again, everyday business activities like HR were exempted from the system. That maybe was probably the biggest news for SMEs, is it sort of just eliminated a whole category of things that people had to think about in terms of compliance. Number 2, and a bit similarly, quantitative thresholds for personal information. So, if you are sending a certain amount of information abroad, then you trigger, going through one of these processes. That was raised by tenfold, actually, for the higher security assessment process. And they're also introduced standard contracts, at a lower level. So again, like kind of, very visibly like lifting the compliance burden for companies. And again, because it's a relatively low number, this is pretty good news for SMEs that are just handling lower amounts of data. Number 3, and I want to spend a little bit more time on this one because I think there's been quite a bit of misunderstanding about this, is some of the regulatory uncertainty surrounding important data was reduced. I'll try to avoid the legalese that was in the regulation, but essentially it says that if you're a company and you hold some kind of data that the government hasn't designated as important, let's say chemical industry supply chain data, if the government hasn't said that's important, then you don't have to worry about tripping over, stepping in some compliance pothole and getting yourself in trouble. So it also said, however, that companies need to follow the regulations, and the language is a little bit unclear. What me and my colleagues have observed, even from some high-profile law firms, is what I see as bad advice, that companies don't need to do anything, that they can just sit and passively wait for the government to come tell them that they have important data or what it is, and they don't have to do anything. I think doing nothing is generally bad advice in China. I mean, you should always be taking some steps to acknowledge that you're trying to be compliant. And in this case, what they're asking companies to do, which again was not exactly clear in the regulatory text itself, is to be going through this process of quote unquote data classification, where you're looking at all the data in your company, working with regulators as they roll out this process of determining who has important data. So a little bit of chicken and egg in that, but again, there's been some what I see as bad advice that companies can do nothing, and that's not the case. And then finally, granting FTZs official, kind of pilot policy power with work focused on data export negative lists. I have a full section on that, so we'll come back to that later. Another thing I want to highlight with this is sort of signaling at the Cyberspace Administration of China. For those of you who don't know, the CAC actually has a monthly magazine. Funny enough, for a long time, the digital agency of China had a paper-only magazine. It is now published online on WeChat. Anybody can get it, so you have to jump through a few hoops. But this is kind of like the CAC's party journal. And so they're using it to signal up to sort of top-level officials, that they hear the message and they're implementing it, and then also kind of set the direction of their own bureaucracy, set KPIs at a high level and make sure everybody's on the same page. The June issue of this magazine was essentially devoted to talking about the March regulations and some broader issues related to data strategy. And it really signaled very strongly that the priorities of the agency had been rebalanced. Kind of from the beginning, CAC's mission was always to think about data security and the data economy, the digital economy together. But over the last few years, it was really strongly on security. That has been rebalanced. So to sort of look at the language, they want to ensure that data security is compatible with high quality development, opening up, and a new development pattern. Again, this is really a new or a renewed political target for the agency, and hopefully that translates into better, easier sort of interactions with officials on an everyday level, because their mission has changed at least a little bit. So summing up the impacts, although it's not explicitly written, SMEs really were the biggest target of these rules. And there were really two aims. One is, as I said, to have a little bit better ease of doing business, because those were the top level goals of the party that they were messaging very strongly the last couple years. And also for the benefit of the agency itself, which had been kind of overwhelmed with its own compliance processes, so reducing that. Really what's happened is the least tenable aspects of the system were dialed back. Again, the regulatory target has been adjusted, rebalancing a bit more toward security supports business rather than security for its own sake. And really the end message is, I think, for some SMEs, this is perhaps maybe largely the end of the story for a while. I mean, if you're a company that is clearly in a non-sensitive sector, doing something like wholesale e-commerce, and handling amounts of personal information that are below those thresholds, I think largely you don't have to think too much about this security regime, this compliance regime. I'll put a massive grain of salt next to that, as it's still evolving. You still definitely need to pay attention. It still could change. So that state of affairs may change a bit, but again, good news if your company is kind of in those least sensitive categories. In terms of remaining challenges, the higher thresholds for personal information, I mean, they're not that high, right? I mean, 1 million people sounds like a lot, but not in a market where there's of 1.4 billion. So I think for many companies, it'll still be a challenge to try to get through the data export security assessments, although we'll see in the next section for at least some things are raising those limits further, which is really exciting. And then again, the important data question is still looming, and that's going to take really quite a number of years to fully figure out. Now, moving on to what's going on with the FTZs. I'm not sure how much you guys are keeping up with this, but it has emerged to be, I think, even more important than I thought it was going to be at the beginning of the year. Kind of my original expectation with this is that, essentially the job of the FTZs would be to take the relaxations of the March rules and simply make them bigger, right? Pilot, further easing. Work at the FTZs had indeed begun well prior to the March rules. The March rules kind of put an official stamp on this. I think, like for Shanghai, for example, it was written into local regulations as early as, I think, 2022, that FTZs were going to play a role in cross-border data compliance. My current viewpoint has changed a little bit. I think pilot relaxation is not the critical short-term goal. FTZs, in my view, are being used to refine the rules, but that does not necessarily mean relaxing them. Another important task is continued capacity building. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And long term, I think FTZs are potentially a key element of cross-border data governance in perpetuity. I think there's a potential that these will be the hubs of cross-border data trade kind of going forward in a kind of more permanent role. But that's a bit more of a hypothesis. Bottom line, these zones are driving, they're the driving force of regulatory implementation. But I think work to date raises as many questions as it does answers. Just quickly to review the three main ones, Tianjin, Shanghai, and Beijing. There's a fourth one, Fujian. There's a little bit less going on there. I didn't put it on this chart. Tianjin was the first one. It's also, I think, the least developed. It uses a negative list system, but in my view, it's so vague at this point that it's maybe not necessarily useful. Shanghai was shortly after Tianjin. They took a totally different track, focused on data whitelists. Given that nationally the government is doing a negative list system, I'm not really sure how meaningful it is or what they're trying to do. Certainly their whitelist didn't do much for the companies that we talked to. And they're also going to do a negative list in the near future, which I think is going to be quite confusing at how you do a positive list and a negative list at the same time. But the most important of these, I think by a long shot, is Beijing. So they released an initial tranche of negative lists as well as kind of regulations a few months ago, and these are the most developed by far by a huge margin. Highly detailed negative lists for 5 sectors: auto, pharma, aviation, e-commerce, and AI. And these provided really the most granular look into what important data is that I've seen at all anywhere, which is really interesting. Substantial increases in personal information thresholds for e-commerce, which is really great. That was raised from 1 million to 5 million. I think it's a really good sign, not just for Beijing, but probably soon for the rest of the country. But limited relaxations in other areas, including some backward movement. So I want to focus on 4 major questions that I have about what's going on with these FTZs. Number one is, how much power do these pilots actually have? This is a bit more of a question at the beginning of the year, but essentially the March 2024 rules don't provide a concrete indication. Authorities want experimentation, but they don't want complete departure. It's not clear how much they want to do, and indeed, with the sort of initial kind of whitelists and things going on in Shanghai, our clients were pretty pessimistic, holding the view that, perhaps, the FTZs have power to creatively implement enforcement, but not actually do any relaxation. That doubt, I think, has been addressed at least a little bit because, as I mentioned, Beijing FTZ raised PI thresholds beyond what they were in the March rules, at least in a few certain narrow cases. Although, again, they sort of went backward in other areas. PI thresholds were actually lowered from the March rules in a few other of the lists. So my hypothesis looking forward is that FTZs will feel empowered to loosen the rules kind of only around the edges and only in the least controversial areas. Although it's clear that e-commerce is one of them, which I think is hopefully good news for at least some of the people in this room. Number 2, what impact is there outside of the FTZs? This question is perhaps my main concern, and it has arisen just recently. So in essence, hopefully we don't get too in the weeds here, but the FTZ pilots in some cases are actually increasing restrictions rather than decreasing them. And the clearest example of that is in the automotive data list for Beijing FTZ. In case you don't know, the CAC released regulations in this area in 2021. It's really the only area where there's like solid regs on describing what important data is. And it listed 3 or 4 things. The Beijing FTZ expanded on those 3 or 4 things, giving us more detail, which is arguably good, arguably not good. But it also added a few more that weren't in those regs. And the strange situation here is that given how the national rules are written, that important data is not important until we say it is, it would seem that the rules are actually stricter inside the FTZ rather than outside, which is pretty strange. This is also true because, again, there were rules for the aviation sector, and the aviation regulator, the CAAC, hasn't released these rules yet. So again, stricter in the FTZ than it is outside. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but again, back to this sort of viewpoint I have now that the FTZs are being used to refine rules and not necessarily relax them. I think these are going to provide major signals for the tightening of, or the loosening, but also the tightening of rules kind of outside the FTZs in China in general. This could be a temporary situation, and kind of that the FTZs have gotten a little bit too far ahead. But I suspect that they're going to kind of stay ahead. So that'll be a really interesting thing to watch. Number 3, how FTZs will treat R&D data. This again is another case of like looking at what's going on here and sort of extrapolating that to how the entire security regime reviews R&D data. Again, a little bit in the weeds, but recently effective just this month were standards on data classification. I mentioned this process where every company has to look at all their data and decide, what's important, what might be important data. The Technical Standards Committee, their standards went into effect just a few weeks ago, and they sort of make reference to R&D data, basically in science and tech, which is not surprising. Specifically mention algorithms and chips in the sort of like high-tech areas that China definitely wants to sort of keep its lead or, keep a hold on IP. So that wasn't too surprising. But the FTZ pilots are adding a bit more on here that raises concerns for me. Ditto in the Beijing FTZ's important data guidance. It highlights R&D data to a greater degree than the national standards do, and is saying that any high-value data related to industrial competitiveness or R&D design, that this all could potentially fall under important data. Again, this puts the FTZ ahead of the rest of the nation, makes things a little bit more strict there than elsewhere, and obviously that's still quite vague. So the takeaway here is that R&D data will definitely be subject to this important data classification scrutiny. How that will shake out for individual companies is going to depend on what sector you've been in. But again, it's signaling to me that the FTZs are piloting this and are really the thing to watch about where this is all going. Again, it's specifically for individual sectors because that's how they're releasing the negative list, right, sector to sector. Finally, more of a good question is how can companies, including SMEs, benefit? I will say that the folks that we've spoken to and companies that we've spoken to that have been in the FTZs, the folks there are really quite eager to help out companies. That's not surprising. I mean, their KPIs are to get companies to locate in the zones for at least at the minimum tax revenue. Most of these benefits seem to hinge on at least a company office in the FTZ, but additional requirements are really unclear. I will say that there's a fairly clear interest in pursuing large companies locating in these zones, but there's no sort of limit on who can do it, at least not that I've seen. So I think this is something that's welcome for smaller companies. And then some aspects of what they're doing, including these like service centers. They're essentially kind of like government-supported technical consultancies that got started, again, a little bit before the March regs. These seem to be playing a role a bit beyond the FTZs, and it may be possible to reach out to them for help, even if you're not in these zones. The indications now, at least to me, are that it's going to be a bit widely available. So again, I think that one of the key missions of the FTZs is really just capacity building. And I think that will be important for everyone, regardless of where they are, and that this capacity will be used, at least somewhat flexibly. That's my hope, anyway. Switching, finally, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but the Network Data Security Management Regulations, which were recently passed. For this, I think it's more important to understand what they mean rather than what's in them. So, I mentioned earlier that, China is coming out of what I see as an effective trial implementation and to a bit more maturity, a bit more, confidence in what's going on. And that is the main signal of these regulations. So, because China is trying to implement and build at the same time, or build the airplane as it's flying it, as we like to say, it could have built out the lower part of the system before it solidified the top part. Like, these regulations are a key bridge in sort of our stack of regs between the top level laws and what's going on on the ground. Like, for example, the data export security assessments. And so those parts of the system that you guys have perhaps interacted with were built out before these regulations were finalized, which is a bit of an odd situation. And so what's been done, these regs changed a lot from their draft version, which was released 3 years ago. But what they effectively did is took all of that experience from those 3 years and then wrote it into the regs, right? So they did it in this sort of backward way. So kind of not much actually changed with their publication, but again, a really important signal that we're, moving on to a system that is, at least framework-wise, a little bit more mature, and that there's going to be a little bit less uncertainty going forward. Key message. Finally, some practical implications and what our road ahead looks like. Again, I mean, this is a really, I think, landmark year in terms of really locking in the direction, we might say. So priorities readjusted to favor business, burdens reduced, especially for SMEs, the action's surely happening in FTZs now. But there's a lot of work to be done. I have two boxes up here. In the near future, it's going to be about this sectoral data classification and these export lists that I mentioned. And then I think kind of harmonization of what is going on in these FTZs. I didn't quite get into it, but the FTZs also contradict each other a little bit, which is quite confusing. And then I'm really seeing, like a 4 to maybe 6 year timeline, to where we're eventually working toward like a unified system and having consensus solutions for data exports. Kind of what we're looking at now in terms of next steps and how your companies might interact with this is, again, this data classification system that I've mentioned. It will be a very long chain of kind of normative risk discussions, that involve companies, that involve, industry regulators, and so on and so forth, asking, okay, what about chemical supply chains, for example, is risky or not? How do we balance that against, business needs and so on and so forth? And it just is going to take a few years to get through kind of all of these questions in all of these sectors. What, my action items, my suggested action items for SMEs would be, of course, closely monitor relevant sectoral regulators for updated rules. Companies that, suspect they might be in sensitive sectors should expect rules to continue to tighten, right? Again, these areas where we've sort of decided or it's clear the government doesn't think there's much risk, those I think will continue to loosen. Again, e-commerce is the one that's very clear. But in other areas, the tightening is not over yet. Companies at least sensitive can expect loosening. Closely monitor these FTZ pilots. Again, at least for now, I see them as the major policy driver. And what goes on in them is going to be a signal for what policy becomes nationwide. And then finally, look for ways to perhaps be more closely involved in sectoral regulations and FTZ pilots, if that's something you think your company can benefit from. Again, back to this sort of work that's going to happen from now with these many normative discussions, with regulators that will certainly involve companies, where they really have to make many judgment calls. I think there will be opportunities, at least to understand what these discussions are, and maybe to influence them. Although maybe, yeah. So I think that's about it. Hopefully that wasn't too much of a tsunami of technical information.
Thank you very much, Tom, for the insightful presentation. And I believe it was especially relevant to see what SMEs should expect and what they can do to prepare themselves for what's to come. So moving forward, we have a second speech on this topic, Mr. Simone Ciampi, Connecting Online, General Manager from Exprivia Asia. I see we have the connection. Can you hear us correctly?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much for giving me the chance to attend this very important conference. Let me just quickly introduce myself. I'm Simone Ciampi, and I'm General Manager for Exprivia Solution Asia. And I'm also the Vice National Chair for the ICT Working Group of the European Chamber of Commerce in China. And as ICT Working Group of the European Chamber, we also have a dedicated chapter, a dedicated sub-working group specifically for the cybersecurity, because of course it's a topic which is getting more and more relevance also in China. As a company, actually, Exprivia is part of the Exprivia group. Just a quick introduction. So actually, we are one of the leading Italian company on digital technology, and our target is to offer a comprehensive digital transformation solution for our clients. We are in China since 2014, and we are present in Shanghai, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, and also Suzhou. And what is our target is to be the technological partner for our clients. So going to cybersecurity, cybersecurity is something that has been getting more and more importance in starting from the adoption of the GDPR in Europe, and then following with the legal framework that China is setting up, as described by Tom a few minutes earlier. So that's why we, as Exprivia, we have decided to set up our own cybersecurity observatory, which is made by professional, of course, valuable partnership, but also a lot of certification, which are very, very important on this topic, in order to, with two targets. The first one is to monitor the situation. So actually through our threat intelligence report, which we public by country. So we have for Europe, we have for Italy, for Spain, but also for Mexico and Brazil. And now we are doing quarterly and updates for China, on where we just monitor the incidents and the actually how the incidents are affecting the business. So what are the instruments that the hackers they try to implement in order to infiltrate inside the data and inside our clients. And on the other side, of course, also to protect, try to support our clients to protect their information, to fortify their defense, and mainly to minimize and to mitigate the risk. Those are the three laws that which are mainly impacting, actually in China, the business of our clients. And just insights, actually, our clients are mainly foreign companies doing business in China. Okay, so we don't work with any or very few local players. And so the three laws, the cybersecurity, the data security, and the personal information protection law are the laws that we are talking about. And in terms of course, IT perspective, the first one, the cybersecurity law, is the one which has impact mainly on the IT infrastructure of the companies doing, operating in China. So network infrastructure, licensing status, adoption of proper protection measure like antivirus, multi-factor authentication, and so far. But not only, I mean, also in terms of assigning a person in charge to monitor and to supervise the cybersecurity of the company, to have a proper incidents, let's say, behavior and list in order to react promptly in case of problems, and so on. The data security, of course, refers mainly to how data are managed, classified, and protected inside the company. And then the last one, personal information protection law, mainly refers more to legal part, but in terms of IT, of course, we are still responsible for how those data are kept inside the company, protected, and if those data, as well as the sensitive data of the data security law, are transferred abroad. Of course, one of the discussing with our clients since the implementation of these three different laws, one of the question is, what should I do? What is the status? And I totally agree with Tom that, at the moment, the situation is kind of, let's say, stable. So they have implemented the three laws, the three laws, but they are still evolving. So actually, they're still finding all the implementation rules and all the they will take time, but this doesn't mean that the company should stay and should only wait for the next regulation to come. So though the action that we are suggesting to our clients are the one I listed here. And the first one is definitely to start with the security risk assessment and analysis. This is important no matter what, no matter the regulation is active or is enforcing or not enforcing, but it's important also to be aware of your status, because actually the regulation is just one phase, okay, of the problem. But at the end, we have also the risk to be hacked, to be attacked, to be, to be to suffer from a cyber incident. So we need to be ready, and we need to know what is our situation, and we need to be aware that step by step we need to start to be compliant with the rules and regulations that China is setting up. And this usually includes an assessment done together with with the clients, but also what we are suggesting is to run periodical penetration and vulnerability assessment and testing in order to really assess the safety and let's say the status of the safety of the company and the IT structure. After this, it's important to give to our clients, which usually, our clients are small and medium enterprises, so they have a very limited or even no IT department in China. So what we are trying to deliver is a report with the ASIS and the to-be situation in order to give them the chance to talk with the headquarters, to let them understand what is the status of the art in China and what are the to be, so how to start to be compliant with the rules and regulation, and how to be better protected versus cyber attacks. Then it's important to guide the client, the companies to start step by step to be compliant. Doesn't mean that it's from 0 to 100, but something can be implemented step by step, starting from the infrastructure of the IT infrastructure of the company, and then passing by the regulatory compliances. And also for maybe the bigger size company, also to put in place some event monitor and incident response. This will enable, of course, the companies to be for sure better protected versus cyber attacks. What is important is also awareness and training, because the majority of the incidents happen because people are not well trained, are not aware of the risk, and so they just do not pay enough attention. So that's why a common practice that we always suggest is to simulate phishing exercise, for example, in order to let also user understand and be trained on how to avoid to expose the company to potential cybersecurity risk. And this is exactly what we did, for example, in one of our with one of our clients, so in which we started to from a simple and very basic assessment, then including a questionnaire on site inspection, penetration and vulnerability test, and then we ended up with the deployment of security information and events and event management, which of course helped the organization in this case to first detect, then analyze, and then respond to the security threats they may have. This is our let's say experience and also our let's say suggestion that we may give to the small and medium foreign companies operating in China. Thank you.
We're going to open the floor to questions, so I would like to invite once more Tom to join us here on the stage. Okay, so let's start with Alessio.
Okay, thank you both for the brilliant presentations. I have one question which I think we haven't touched upon this issue during the presentation. So we talked about in your presentation specifically about the data transfer, the regulations, and so on, but from the perspective of foreign companies. What about the China, you know, in your talks with clients or partners, have you ever, you know, discussed the perception of Chinese companies? Because these regulations apply to Chinese companies as well. So maybe if it doesn't apply to you, but maybe you work with a Chinese supplier, your Chinese partner, maybe you might not face restrictions, but your client might. So have you, you know, covered the perception of Chinese companies about these regulations? Thank you.
We haven't worked with Chinese companies on this, you know, per se, but, you know, the short answer is that, you know, they are every bit as subject to this as anyone else, kind of if they are, you know, sending data abroad. And they definitely have to go through all of these different data classification processes and so on and so forth. And, you know, I think for Chinese companies, you know, especially as China continues to, you know, push its companies to go abroad, to do more business, sort of outside of China, it's going to be, you know, perhaps just as much of a challenge for them as it is everyone else. I mean, obviously they'll be Chinese, so there'll be maybe a few less barriers in terms of interacting with the system, at least in terms of language, you know, and interacting with people. But, you know, it will be a challenge for them. And it's a curious question as those challenges, you know, mount. I think an interesting sort of theoretical question going forward is, you know, how will that, you know, push the Chinese government to, you know, adjust the system, you know, one way or another, because again, it will be an impediment.
Before moving back to the audience questions, I would also like to raise a question that we've received from the online attendees. Do you see the Chinese regulatory framework as influencing other countries in structuring their regulations on this subject? And do you expect to have any harmonization either towards the Chinese modus operandi or anyway at the global level, an harmonization in these regulatory frameworks?
Yeah, this is a fantastic question. And indeed, it's something I've been writing about recently is how exactly, you know, this system is going to influence the global system. In my view, I think China has been a little bit ahead of the curve, you know, in terms of how cross-border data security should be thought about. Interestingly enough, large parts of this system were inspired by how it's done in the US. So the whole important data regime really kind of took its cues from how the US government manages government data. And they took that, adapted it, and sort of expanded it. And I think now it's kind of, we're just seeing it start to echo back into the rest of the world. And so I'd make 2 points in terms of, you know, seeing it actually adopted or having a very, you know, in a clear way. That just happened actually for the first time in Vietnam about, I think, 2 months ago. So they had their, I can't remember if it's draft or final, but they incorporated this important data regime and even used Chinese terminology, like use those words. So it's definitely going to spread, at least in the region. But I think, at least conceptually, you know, these sorts of ideas where, you know, if we say, a loose analogy is to say important data is really industrial data, and industrial data, has risks associated with it. It's also valuable. Other countries are seeing this as well, and well, now there is a template or for at least one way to sort of think about these risks. And so I think it will inevitably influence what other countries do. So in the same way, or in a similar way that China looked at GDPR and formulated PIPL, I think Europe, the US, and other places will look at what China's doing and at least have their own take, at least study it.
Thank you. I have maybe two questions for the speakers. The first question is, you mentioned, Tom, that one thing to look out for in the future will be to see how important data is defined. And my understanding is that this is something that is under the different ministries. Mm-hmm. Do we see any timelines? Do we see any ministries that are a bit further ahead than others? So that's the first question. And the second question is, yes, there is a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of definitions and standards and, maybe refining of regulations. But then the other aspect is how CAC interprets the necessity of doing cross-border data transfers, and that interpretation may be different from that of companies. And potentially it could be a much more narrow interpretation. How have you seen the evolution in terms of the different CACs when it comes to interpreting what is necessary for businesses to transfer across borders?
Thank you. These are both very excellent questions. In terms of which sectors or industries are going to be first, the very first thing I would refer to you is the list that were released in Beijing. So it was automotive, which again, that was really the first one that happened already a few years ago, at least in a preliminary way. Aviation, AI data, which China has its own sort of strategic interests in. That's why they sort of defined in that way, actually loosened it for the benefit of Chinese companies. And then I forget now what the other two were, but e-commerce and biotech, yeah. So these industries are they're already the ones that are doing this. Finance is another one. So like anything that's like healthcare and finance, because those regulators already think about these issues and have sort of stake and power in them. And are really kind of like poised to do it, or more in a position to take this forward. It'll happen with them first. The other agency is MIIT, so like kind of anything to do with industrial data. So they're sort of implementing regulations and in terms of like how they're structuring their own processes, how they think about it in their agency. That's kind of well underway, and so it'll happen there as well. The other agency I think is maybe a bit behind the others is the Ministry of Natural Resources. And that includes things like mapping data that ties into auto. And again, it's something that's kind of already happening. In terms of which industries are going to be very slow, I'm not sure I have thought about that, like which ones will be last. But certainly these ones that I've mentioned are a little bit further ahead, and really especially the ones for which we have negative lists. In Beijing and the ones that have been referenced in the other FTZs. And then remind me of the second question again, sorry? Yeah, necessity, yeah. That is a really fantastic question. So, as I mentioned in my presentation, what we're looking at now, we're staring down the barrel of is, the real nitty gritty work of making the system happen. And again, it's a very long chain of normative discussions that are, going to have to happen in the regulators, thinking about risks, thinking about, business considerations, and so on and so forth. And it is in those processes where we're going to figure out like what necessity means. And although, the government, the CAC, and whatever agencies that, have power in a particular discussion, they will be the ones who make the call. these will be areas for negotiation. I think there'll be areas where there continues to be trial and error, right? Because when you make this sort of decision about what's necessity and what's not, those do have real business consequences. And the question is, are those business consequences acceptable to the Chinese government or not? And that's not necessarily, something that the government's going to get right to its own satisfaction the very first time. So again, that's why I think this is going to take a number of years to happen, because again, all of these things are really just judgment calls. And we just have to get through them and have all those detailed discussions.
I see we have, do we have any other comments from also Simone's side on these questions?
I mean, on this, actually, what is the let's say, how the CAC is interacting with also companies, and this is also, of course, is depending on different provinces and different CAC and whatever. But at the moment, what we have been seeing, interacting with clients and CAC is quite, for the moment, a cooperation. Actually, they are not going there to struggle too much. They're just cooperating with the companies. And what is important from a company perspective is to start to do something. So to show the CAC that you are implementing something, you are not just waiting for, and so maybe you are doing the first assessment, you are taking the first measures. If they see a proactive approach, usually they are willing to cooperate, giving you time to improve, giving suggestions. So there is an interaction between the parties. It is not just strictly implementing what the rules and the regulation are saying. This is my experience.
If I could add a couple sentences onto that, that's really encouraging to hear that officials are being a bit more cooperative and a bit more helpful. Because the companies we talked to a couple years ago very much had a different take on their interactions with CAC at the time. And so again, as I mentioned in the presentation, this sort of like attitude shift that kind of happened in March.
I think that the situation changed. Change after. The approach changed a bit. So I think that now it's we are able to. Not all the time. Then also it's depending on the situation, because sometimes the situation it's really complicated and it's hard to discuss. Actually, nothing to say. But if you are not doing anything too serious, I think that the cooperation is possible.
Yeah, many thanks for these presentations, very insightful. A lot of the SMEs, a lot of the European SMEs in China are pretty inherently attached at the hip as suppliers to larger OEMs, both Chinese but also foreign OEMs, which they themselves will have a lot more data moving across borders. So I wonder, is there a connection or is there something that SMEs should take into consideration if they themselves maybe don't have so much data that it goes above these thresholds, but they're direct suppliers of key technologies that may be data connected somehow, or data might run through it, and how should they be vigilant about those connections to these larger companies and larger brands that might have data flows that go beyond those thresholds?
Yeah, I wish I had a specific example to just kind of like play out for you, but generally speaking, I think this is a really important question that SMEs need to be considering. Again, given, as you said, attached at the hip. So exactly in what sort of case or how it might impact them is perhaps difficult to say. I'll say in one area, just sort of like brainstorming, in things like where we're working on things like digital software or building things where we have different processes in different countries, right, that are like doing parts of data processing for a product. What happens with that? Where like you have to send it in and out. I think companies that deal with those kinds of things are, almost certainly going to have challenges of some sorts. Again, I wish I had more concrete examples to tell you, but it is absolutely something that companies should be asking themselves, sort of the large OEMs that they work with, the ones that are going to be more surely impacted negatively by the system.
Thank you very much. And Simone, do you also have something to add to this?
Not really. Actually, I think the pretty comprehensive answer.
Thank you. Then I'd say we can move to the next question. Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much, Tom and Simone, for your great interventions. Regarding your clients, because you work a lot with SMEs, could you indicate 2 or 3 questions that you receive most commonly in terms of doubts that your SMEs have and that you think they are of major concern that you are able to assist them? Thank you.
Yeah, we work a bit more with large MNCs than SMEs, although we do of course do both. But I would say the most common question we have coming in is just very basic. Can you explain what's happening? Like start from square one and sort of understand this whole thing, right? Like perhaps that's not a very satisfying answer, but like square one questions I think are the things we get most often.
I think that from our side, actually, I mean, especially for SMEs, the main, actually, is not the question they raise to us or they ask to us, but actually, majority of the time, we are the one who inform our clients that they need to start to pay attention to these laws. I mean, to cybersecurities and especially cross-border data transfers or PIPL and data security and data. I mean, how you manage data, because actually, majority of them they are not really aware at the moment about the situation, the risk. So especially when they implement a new, or they want to implement in China their own ERP that they are actually having in the headquarters. So we need to at least mention to them and make them aware that there are rules or regulations that they may consider before taking any decision. So at the moment, it's not really a concern from them. It's mainly our concern to let them be informed about the existence of those regulations.
Thank you very much. I think we still have the time to have a final round of questions for the speakers.
Thank you. So I have a question for Simone. You mentioned you have these quarterly reports on China incidents, that cybersecurity incidents that happen in the country. So what are the, let's say, the most common incidents that foreign SMEs, but also larger companies in China face from a cybersecurity perspective?
The majority is phishing and the ransomware attack. Okay, so these are the two major, which somehow are also connected, but not all the time. So those are the two. And what is funny is that those kind of incidents, especially on ransomware, increased a lot after the cybersecurity laws have been implemented. So before we had very few cases, and then suddenly after the deployment of the laws, actually the number of incidents increased. So I don't know if it's completely independent or not, but that's the case. So the increasing number of incidents and especially ransomware or phishing attack.
I see we have an additional question coming from the audience, so thank you very much.
Hello, both. Yes, this area is something I don't know much about. I have 2 questions. One is, it sounds like only a small portion of data can be exported outside, across border. Majority of the data generated by the company will stay onshore. Yeah. So does China have the AI or whatever data processing capacity to really utilize this data or analyze those data for those companies? That's first. And second, I remember DD's IPO list attempt was retracted a few years back. So which law did it violate? Does that also mean, like, in the future, Chinese IT companies or data-related companies cannot get listed overseas in the US or Europe?
I'll take the second one first, just because that's a really fun one. Like, we followed that case very closely. And the short answer, I can't have trouble mustering all the specific details at the time, but they actually weren't violating a law. And what happened was, what we gathered, right, is that officials had talked to them and didn't want them to do the IPO, right? And they essentially ran through the door at the last second, kind of before regulations came down. And so actually doing it, technically, it was not illegal, but it was definitely against the wishes of the government. And then regulations were put in place after the fact that then, you know, basically backwardly sort of justified, you know, what the government did. Again, I would have to maybe look at my notes for exactly how that happened, but it was, you know, quite an odd situation, one that had kind of permanent weird consequences for like this particular area of law. I think it was the Cybersecurity review. That's what it was. Yeah, and it kind of like changed how that cybersecurity review worked. It transformed it into a more powerful tool, actually. But like, it really kind of didn't make a lot of sense, I guess. It was a very interesting situation. Again, we could perhaps speak later. I could send you some notes from the time about that, because that was a few years ago. And then in terms of, you know, capacity building and stuff, you know, in China, I mean, this speaks to the other part of China's strategy, right? So if we look, I think, specifically at like the data security law, which is a little bit misnamed. It really should be called the data governance law, because it's about, you know, China trying to get the most out of data it has. You know, I think also recently this year, you know, we're seeing, you know, China's overall kind of data strategy sort of like come into view, you know, and that revolves around, as you said, keeping valuable data in China as much as possible, but also attracting more of it from abroad. And then, of course, investing sort of in the infrastructure here to, you know, do things with it, right? There is a massive program called the National Unified Computing Power Network, which is essentially trying to build like a national grid of data centers, right, that are, you know, located strategically throughout the country to provide services, you know, affordably, quickly, and also with a really, really strong eye toward renewable energy, and like getting the most out of China's renewable energy infrastructure. You know, the actual answer that you want, though, is like, will they be able to provide those adequately? You know, like, will it be competitive enough versus doing this abroad? I think that is a really, really important question that I don't have the answer to right now. And of course, that's the one I think is also clouded by geopolitics. You know, geopolitics and sort of like technical realities together, where it's like, okay, well, you can't buy the cutting edge chips right now, so well, you know, kind of what does all that mean? So those, I mean, that gets into sort of like business strategy type stuff and, you know, technologist type questions, and I'm more of a technology policy person. So I can't quite answer that, but at least, you know, those are kind of how I would outline it, I guess.
I would like to thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
A big round of applause for both our speakers.
Thank you.
Nunlist, Simone, Ciampi.
Thank you.
Thank you.